In his defense of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill made a claim that created something of a problem for utilitarianism. It's a problem that John Rawls, in his article, Two Concepts of Rules, helped to solve. The problem can be asked in the form of a question. What do you do when rules adopted to maximize utility command an action that certainly will not maximize utility? According to Mill, we're to use these rules and principles as signposts pointing us in the way of maximizing utility. But what do you do when you come to a signpost that is clearly pointing in the wrong direction? Example: you borrow $20 from a coworker and you promise that you would pay back before lunch the next day. As lunchtime approaches, you realize that you would get more enjoyment from the $20 than the person you made the promise to would lose by not getting the money. If utility is always the final standard, then it seems that you would be wrong not to keep the money and spend it on what you want. Paying that person back would not, in this case, maximize utility. There's also the problem of what to do when two rules conflict. Mill writes, quote, "The principle of utility is good for anything. It must be good for weighing these conflicting utilities against one another and marking out the region within which one or the other preponderates." End quote. But it's doubtful that there is ever a time in which there is no conflict in one's duties, particularly if one includes a duty of benevolence or to provide help to those in need. This would seem to imply, then, that we must always be appealing to the principle of utility and thus always acting on the motive of maximizing utility. If we must always act on the principle of utility, then this seems to go against Mill's own arguments that it's legitimate to use rules and principles as signposts. Instead, we must at each and every instance ask if the signpost is accurate. The consequence of these problems is that they seem to imply that the rules have very limited use, that we should almost always be acting to maximize utility. Rawls' solution is to argue that there are, as he says, two concepts of rules. I think it's easier to understand Rawls' account of rules by looking at the analogy that he uses to explain them. Rawls looks at the rules that are used in a sport or a game. It seems clear that the primary reason for a sport or a game is entertainment. In the case of some sports, the goal might be profit, but sports create profits by being entertaining. A sport or a game consists in a set of rules with respect to how the game is to be played. The rules aim to make for an entertaining game. The rules are constantly being evaluated according to whether a change in the rules would make the game more entertaining. And yet, one does not violate the rules, even when doing so will make the game or sport more entertaining or more profitable. We may change the rules to provide for more entertainment or more profitability. Professional sports do this all the time. In 2023, Major League Baseball added a pitch clock, limiting the amount of time a pitcher had to throw the next pitch. This was done to shorten the game, to keep the action going, to make the game both more entertaining and more profitable. The rule utilitarian can make the same argument. The rules under which actions are evaluated are like the rules of a game under which plays within the game are evaluated. The moral rules are evaluated according to their contribution to utility. Individual actions are evaluated according to whether they are in accordance with or violate the rules. This includes rules that govern what to do in the case of conflict. Rawls argues, quote, "There is nothing contradictory or surprising in this. Utilitarian or aesthetic reasons might properly be given in arguing that the game of chess or baseball is satisfactory just as it is, or in arguing that it should be changed in various respects. But a player in a game cannot properly appeal to such considerations as reasons for his making one move rather than another." End quote. Rawls applies these principles to two moral practices, the practice of keeping promises and the practice of punishment. The sports analogy is particularly useful in understanding the institution of punishment. Rule utilitarianism justifies punishment on the grounds that it produces good effects. But why do we punish people who drive while drunk or rob stores or commit or threaten to commit violent assaults, commit fraud, and the like? To the utilitarian, what justifies all actions is that it produces good consequences. We consider what society would be like with a system of punishment and without. We judge that the society with punishment would be safer. In virtue of these good consequences, we endorse the practice of having laws and punishments attached to the breaking of laws. But this reliance on consequences means that we're looking at the future to determine who should be punished. We're not looking at the past. Imagine being on trial. While you sit at the defense table, the court carries on a debate about the merits of punishing you. The prosecutor brings up the benefits of punishing you, while your defense attorney brings up the harms that would result from your being punished. You protest that you did not commit the crime for which they are thinking about punishing you. The court, speaking with one voice, prosecutor and defense alike, says that your guilt or innocence is irrelevant. Only the consequences of punishing you are important. In order for your innocence to be relevant to the proceedings, one would have to argue that your innocence will influence the consequences. So what's the point here? Utilitarianism is looking to the future to determine the value of punishing you. It's looking at the consequences, at the effects. But the question of whether you are innocent or guilty of a crime looks to the past, at what you did or did not do. It doesn't look to the future. The problem is with reconciling the forward-looking nature of punishment with the backward-looking criteria of guilt or innocence. If only the consequences matter, then guilt or innocence don't matter. We should also note that for the utilitarian, the punishment of the guilty also depends on it producing good consequences. If we could prove somebody guilty, we would still not be justified in punishing them if things are such that the punishment does no good. The guilty party gets away with their crime. Consider somebody who has the intent on killing a particular person. In fact, assume that they have killed that person. They can't kill that person again, and they have no interest in killing anybody else. From this point on, there is every reason to believe that the individual will be a normal and productive member of society, or could perhaps do some good as a skilled doctor or scientist. Utilitarianism seems to imply that punishments would be wrong. It produces no good consequences. And arguing that punishment might still do some good is missing the point. Just imagine a case where the punishment will not do any good. The objection being considered says that on utilitarian grounds, in those conditions, being guilty of a wrongdoing doesn't justify punishment, only good consequences. According to utilitarianism, guilt or innocence is not relevant, or only indirectly relevant to the question of justified punishment. But this seems incorrect. Guilt or innocence seems to be of paramount importance. Rawls's analogy aims to solve this problem. Let us take a sport that contains penalties for certain types of actions, a game that has penalty shots or imposes some type of handicap on a team that violates the rules. Now, this is a game. There is no natural moral law dictating that people who perform certain types of actions deserve punishment or that people performing certain types of actions deserve the benefits of adding to their total points. The rules are adopted for the purpose of utility. Yet within the game, in the playing of the game, only the guilty are punished. By guilty, we mean here the individual or the team that violates the rules. Punishment is not based on what will maximize utility. Punishment is based on an application of the rules, and this includes the rule that only the guilty are to be punished. So let's apply these facts about penalties in a game to the institution of punishment. The rules of punishment, what types of acts are to be punished and what the penalty should be, are justified on the basis of utility, just like the rules for applying penalties in a game. Specific acts of punishment, like specific applications of penalties in a game, are justified in accordance with the rules. In games, where the whole system of rules are defined on the grounds of their contribution to utility, no player is permitted to argue that their act is justified on the grounds that it promotes utility. The only appeal that one can use within the game itself is that one's actions were legal or in accordance with the rules. In other words, in games established solely for utilitarian ends, guilt or innocence is relevant because the best rules make them relevant. Allow me to recap. The utilitarian thesis is that what justifies everything, including institutions of punishment, is that it promotes utility. We look at whether it produces good consequences. But if punishment is based on whether it produces good consequences, then guilt or innocence of the accused is largely irrelevant. Yet in morality, guilt or innocence is extremely relevant. Rawls answers this problem by distinguishing between the justification of the rules on the basis of utility and the justification of acts within the system of rules. Like in sports, where the sport is defined by rules justified on the principle of utility, and acts are evaluated according to their conformity to the rules. There is nothing in sports that allows players to break the rules when doing so will promote utility. And there is nothing in the system of morality that allows people to disregard guilt or innocence in the application of moral penalties.